We know a lot about the Simpsons' next-door neighborino Ned, but what about the house on the other side? 740 Evergreen Terrace is an enigma, an ever-revolving door of one-off and recurring characters. And because we've seen so many of its occupants over the years, I'm not even sure who even lives there anymore. And it's funny because for a show that doesn't age its characters or really maintain any kind of continuity, the neighbours of 740 is the one thing that changes. So let's unravel this very niche Simpsons mystery, looking back at all the neighbours that have come and gone and how the house itself has morphed with them. So let's start things off with the Winfields. Although Sylvia and her husband are the earliest known occupants of 740 Evergreen Terrace, they originally lived in a completely different location. In the third episode of the series, they looked on as a depressed Homer carried a boulder down the street at night.
Young Simpson is going to kill himself.
No, maybe not. Maybe he's just taking his boulder for a walk.
Oh.
Wow, the Winfields are kind of dicks, aren't they? You'll notice here that they're not actually next door to The Simpsons, which wasn't a continuity error as Homer would later run past their home during season 2.
Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Winfield!
Hey, don't you get a haircut, you hippie!
And then in that same season, Sylvia wasn't too pleased when Santa's little helper was caught swimming in her pool in Bart's Dog Gets an F.
This is Sylvia Winfield. That canine of yours is in my pool again. I'm calling the dog warden right now.
How are you?
Fun fact, Sylvia was voiced by Tracy Ullman here. This episode was released in 1991, which was the same year Ullman tried to sue The Simpsons. And if you want to know more about that, check out my Every Simpsons Controversy video. The link is in the description. This episode confirmed that the Winfields lived on the same block as The Simpsons, gradually moving closer and closer to the family that they so despised. They got so close, in fact, that in season 3's Separate Vocations, Sylvia spied on Bart from a window across the street.
Well, it's about time.
Despite their contempt for The Simpsons, they eventually moved right next door, and you'll notice that the house was white instead of brown. And throughout this video, I'll go into how the look and design of the house continually changes. But they didn't last too long because in season 4's New Kid on the Block, Sylvia announced that they were moving once again. Sylvia asked Homer for a few simple favours to help him sell their home. The first was to wear pants, the second to discard his mouldy old jack-o'-lanterns, and the third to clean up his trash. And his answer to all three was...
no.
And to be fair, why should he help them when all they did was mock and belittle him and his family? They seem like grumpy old nosy neighbours to me. Instead, Homer helped himself to their trash, a treasure trove of junk.
Wire hangers? Expired medicine? Old newspapers?
And even though the Winfields were far from the best neighbours, Homer did manage to get some sweet estrogen out of the deal.
That medicine's not for you.
Come on, Marge. Maybe I'm not getting enough estrogen.
Give me that.
He didn't make things easy for them, deterring potential buyers by lounging in Maggie's kiddie pool with a runaway hot dog.
Thought you could get away, huh?
Goodbye.
Like I said before, the Winfields were an older couple that were far too grumpy and a bit too nosy, i.e. a very real couple that you'd probably find in the suburbs. In the past, I actually lived next door to someone who acted just like Sylvia, and man, I hated that woman so much. The more I think about the Winfields, the more I realise that they were a bit underutilised. Think about it, they were the complete opposite of the always positive Ned. Having Homer caught in the middle of him and the cold, heartless Winfields could have made some funny moments. But seeing as they were hardly used, it wasn't a great loss. And with the Winfields gone, in came Ruth and Laura Powers. Following her divorce, Ruth Powers moved to Springfield with her teenage daughter and they became fast friends with The Simpsons, which was a welcome change from the Winfields. It's very easy to see why Bart fell for Laura, who also seemed to like pranks and video games. She was also very happy to babysit The Simpsons kids and even taught Maggie and Snowball to waltz. Unfortunately though, she had some very questionable taste in guys, but when she learned that Jimbo wasn't so tough after all, she dropped him faster than you could say Wet Willie.
Jimbo, I don't think we should see each other anymore. You're just not the guy I thought you were.
Laura disappeared after this, and maybe that's because the writers didn't really know where to take her character. She was too old to be anything than an unrequited first crush. whereas her mother had greater potential as a new friend to Marge as seen in season 5's Marge on the Lam. After attending the ballet together, Ruth took Marge for a night on the town, and we get more insight into her carefree and rebellious nature, teaching Marge to shoot some antique cans before then revealing she'd stolen her ex-husband's car.
Well, didn't you realize all you had to do was report him to the police?
Marge, you're the level-headed friend I never had.
Thus leading to a high-speed desert chase to escape the police. Personally, I always loved this friendship because they balanced each other out really well, because Marge is more timid and has always had difficulty making friends and establishing a life outside of the home, whereas Ruth was more cynical, wild and adventurous who was open to bringing Marge's wild side out too.
I'm sorry, I should have asked first.
No, Marge, you did it. We really are gonna make it now.
Therefore, it is pretty disappointing that the writers didn't continue this relationship after this episode, especially because Marge's only other friends were Helen Lovejoy and Maud, and they are so passive-aggressive, uptight, and pretty similar. But maybe that's for the best because, as we soon learn, she's not the greatest influence. This is because the next time Marge would cross paths with Ruth was in season 14's The Strong Arms of Ma. And here it was implied that she no longer lived at 740 Evergreen Terrace.
Ruth Powers? My old neighbor? Oh my goodness, look at you!
We learned that she served a spell in prison and took up bodybuilding and was soon crowned Miss Mexican Mafia for 3 consecutive years. Marge joined Ruth in working out as a way to process her trauma after being mugged, but soon she encouraged Marge to take steroids and compete as a professional bodybuilder.
If you'd rather be weak and helpless...
No!
This led into one of the worst things that Marge has ever done in the series, drastically altering her personality to the point where she assaulted Homer before going on a rampage at Moe's. And although she wasn't directly responsible for Marge's actions, Ruth used peer pressure to set Marge on a very disturbing path, which I imagine severely undermined their friendship. It's also unknown what became of Laura during Ruth's time in prison, but this could perhaps explain why the Powers quietly moved out. The Powers' former home were put on the market 2 seasons later, with Homer and Marge attending the open house to compare how their neighbours lived. And weirdly, neither Ruth or Laura were mentioned, so it can be assumed that different unseen neighbours had lived there during the meantime. Anyway, Marge was very envious of their swanky new modern kitchen, complete with a bread maker and a walk-in microwave.
Uh-oh.
Ruth did make a brief cameo later on in the episode though, when an angry crowd confronted Homer over Bart introducing Playdudes to the kids in school, although I have no idea why she's so pissed off, seeing as Laura is probably old enough to know all about Playdudes, and even watches naked talk shows.
I should get home to my daughter before that naked talk show comes on.
Weirdly enough though, decades later, in season 33, it's revealed that the Powers had been living next door to the Simpsons all along.
You haven't stopped by to say hello in 25 years, and I live next door.
This timeline definitely doesn't add up, like at all, as I'll soon explain later, but it does serve as a reminder of how underused the Powers were as neighbours. Bodybuilding fiasco notwithstanding, Ruth and Marge had developed a memorable bond at one time, and it was an iconic episode, and I loved their relationship. And despite not being the greatest influence on Marge, Ruth provided a little excitement and was a sympathetic single mother. Marge could have helped Ruth through her problems, and with the Powers still popping up around Springfield from time to time, maybe it is time to return to their old friendship. Now, let's move on to the next occupier, Sideshow Bob. During the Powers' absence from the show, 740 was one of many houses sold during an economic downturn. Not only that, but budget cuts resulted in the release of all minor offenders from Springfield Prison, coinciding with the arrival of the Simpsons' new neighbour, Walt Warren.
Hello, Bart.
Huh? Say that again.
Hello, Bart. Hello, Bart.
And it looked like this new neighbour was nothing more than an upstanding citizen, offering free Wi-Fi and homemade caramel apples. Everyone was welcoming, except for Bart, who was instantly suspicious of him. So, determined to prove that this mysterious figure was in fact Sideshow Bob, Bart tried to lure him into a trap by singing Gilbert and Sullivan. Walt didn't fall for the bait and even hung up a birdhouse below Bart's treehouse just to show how much of a caring and peaceful guy he was. But Bart still wasn't convinced, sneaking inside of his house to search for clues. So let's quickly break down the inside and outside of 740 Evergreen Terrace. The exterior has been painted from white to brown, and the inside is also pretty unremarkable. Gone is the huge kitchen and fancy gadgets that Marge fawned after. Anyway, Bart finally accepts Walt for who he is after visiting Springfield Prison and sees Bob locked up in his cell. So he accepts his neighbour's peace offering of a baseball game. However, once alone, Walt revealed his true self.
I am Sideshow Bob.
He explained how the real Walt Warren was his cellmate, but when he found out that Walt was about to be released, Bob performed some very dodgy plastic surgery on him and stole Walt's identity. Thus leading into Sideshow Bob's most gruesome and diabolical plan yet, which was to murder Bart in the Five Corners, thus evading custody by shooting him across several states. Meanwhile, the real Walt escaped prison wearing Bob's face and took the Simpsons inside the neighbour's house. And it's here that we can see that Sideshow Bob's interior decorating was as tasteful as always. Well, I guess except for the hundreds of Bart photos pinned to his bedroom walls and ceiling. The real Walt Warren rescued Bart, delaying Bob just long enough for the police officers from the 5 states to surround him. And as it turns out, despite all of Bob's efforts to create a new identity, Bart was never truly convinced, alerting Chief Wiggum to track down Bob's hybrid. Bob is known for his meticulous planning, but this was extreme even by his standards. After getting his face back, Walt instantly moved out of the house, but honestly, seeing as Bob had set up such a cozy life for him, it could have been interesting to see how Walt could stay for a while, and see how his dynamic with the family could develop. But then again, I can't really see him creating much conflict or, let's face it, laughs. So yes, as soon as Bob and Walt moved out, it was now Homer's turn for a nightmare neighbour, Ned's cousin Ted.
Howdly dowdly, next door Roonies.
Howdy, Cousin Ted.
Howdy do to you, Cousin Ed. How are Roddy and Toddy?
The family only appeared in one scene as a closing gag, but we can perhaps guess what life would have been like for Homer living between 2 sets of the Flanders. Who knows though, maybe Ted isn't a devout Christian, maybe he's not even left-handed, and maybe that moustache is fake. Whatever happened to Ted's family remains a mystery, but my theory is that Homer probably scared them off somehow. So next up, we have Terrence, Emily, T-Rex, and Corduroy. In season 24's The Day the Earth Stood Cool, Homer had another midlife crisis after being mistaken for Bart's grandfather.
Grandpa!
Oh my god! Should I call an ambulance? Help! An old man is dying!
So desperate to prove that he's still young and hip, he befriended Deviled Donuts vendor Terrence. Because with his tattoos, skull rings, and goatee, Terrence was a hipster cool dad who left Portland when it became too played out. He'd been roaming around the US in his RV, looking to lay down roots when Homer encouraged him to buy the brown house next door.
What a find! Underneath all the ugly renovations, this house has Neutra bones.
In my house, we found human bones.
Before long, 740 Evergreen Terrace was transformed into a house fit for the coolest of dudes, standing out with its stone brickwork, an outdoor patio, giant windows, and a skylight, surrounded by a well-kept border of plants. What's more is that the interior was far more spacious than it had ever been. It was basically an entirely different house. I mean, Terrence is so cool that he even stores books in his fireplace because bookshelves are far too mainstream. And eventually, Homer felt validated by Terrence deeming him cool.
You're a pretty cool guy.
Really? I'm cool? Oh.
But the rest of the family had very different reactions. Terrence's wife Emily boasts a graduate degree in mid-century kitsch, reads satirical newspapers, and shamed Marge for not breastfeeding Maggie. Meanwhile, son T-Rex is just as artsy and pretentious as his parents.
Look at these obscure card games. Hey, do you have Uno?
I did, when I was Uno.
Hey kid, don't you dare dunk Uno. It's one of the best card games ever. It got to the point where Homer changed his entire personality just to fit in with his cool new neighbours, even shaving off his beloved 3 hairs just to match Terrence. And although Marge disapproved of Homer's actions, she tried to be supportive. So the joint families attended concerts, Mexican wrestling, the roller derby, and Korean gangster film festivals. But tensions rose during T-Rex's birthday party in an abandoned slaughterhouse. Marge resented Emily and her judgmental friends for attempting to breastfeed Maggie themselves, while Bart was offended when T-Rex made fun of Homer's awesome homemade gift. And after the boys fought, Terrence ended the family's friendship, leaving Homer feeling discarded until learning that Bart stood up for him.
Yeah, I was sticking up for you.
You? Sticking up for your old man? They can go to hell!
Soon enough, an army of hipsters invaded Springfield, completely taking over the town.
And now they've taken over. It's a hellhole.
Luckily, Bart eventually made amends with T-Rex, giving him a taste of a regular childhood that he'd secretly always wanted, and Homer and Marge helped save Terrence's house and donut cart from a compost fire, therefore ending their feud. But no sooner had the families reunited, a New York Times article declared Springfield America's coolest town, which obviously meant that it wasn't cool anymore, and the time of the hipster had to come to an abrupt end. The Day the Earth Stood Cool was effectively a modern sequel to Homerpalooza, with Homer using a very different method to appear cool before coming to a similar conclusion about self-acceptance. Terrence's family added culture to the Simpsons' lives and upgraded the house next door, but their snobby attitude meant that the families would never really be close friends. Homer should have never changed his lovable persona just to appeal to Terrence, and Springfield's makeover was just too pretentious to ever survive.
Disco Stew has found a new thing.
So finally we come to Anne and Thea Blackburn. The Simpsons' newest short-lived neighbours appeared in season 35's McMansion and Wife. This was 2 years after Ruth Powers moved back, which begs the question, where on earth do the Powers actually live now? Why do they keep disappearing and then suddenly reappearing seasons later? Anyway, after the hipsters left, 340 somehow reverted back to its plain original appearance. But it wouldn't stay this way for long, especially when Anne and Thea Blackburn moved in. Thea owned a sports car dealership and was quick to invite Homer to a round of pickleball and ice cream, while Anne took Marge out for massages. It all sounded too good to be true, and Homer couldn't shake the feeling that their kindness was just a trick to get Homer to buy a very expensive car. Ironically though, Thea insisted that he was just looking for genuine friends, and only wanted him to agree to a few little tweaks on their house.
Why, I like you, Homer. You live next door, and we love our house. It just needs a few tweaks. Tweaks.
Those little tweaks turned out to be a complete renovation, with the Blackburns only using The Simpsons so they would agree to everything they wanted. Thea downplayed their renovation and lent Homer a car from his dealership, only for a gigantic white mansion to block out the Simpsons' sunlight. And to emphasise just how ridiculously extravagant their superficial Blackburns were, they even had a bell tower installed. Asbestos was then dumped into the Simpsons' backyard, while Anne and Thea conveniently disappeared on vacation to avoid any responsibility. However, Lisa and Hubert Wong then discovered that their home sits on the site where Jebediah Springfield founded the town, therefore meaning that Evergreen Terrace is a historic district and renovations are completely forbidden. Homer confronted Thea, realising that they were never true friends and inadvertently ruining Thea's business.
Oh my god, he's right. This doesn't make my junk look any bigger.
It is unlikely the Blackburns ever really learned anything from the conflict, or that we'll ever see them again, because their arrogance probably saw them move to a new location and manipulate other unsuspecting neighbours. We also never really got to see inside their new mansion, reflecting how Homer and Marge never really got that close to Anne and Thea. Their friendship was entirely hollow and as flashy and meaningless as their failed renovation. And the sad part is that Homer and Marge probably would have forgiven them if they'd shown an ounce of sincerity. It could be great if the show kept more consistency with the Simpsons neighbours, but the constant turnover of 740 Evergreen Terrace literally opens up new doors for new types of stories, because you wouldn't really see Ruth Powers building a mansion, for example, and the Blackburn storyline tapped into that all too relatable feeling of being stuck with awful neighbours and not being able to do anything about it. Rotating neighbours also makes storytelling a whole lot easier, because it cuts down locations and gives the writers an easy way to introduce one-off characters without needing much backstory. In terms of the house's visuals, I've always loved how the show mostly always incorporated its redesign as part of the episode story, only to then reset everything all over again. Mostly always turning it from a bog standard pretty boring brown house into a representation of its occupant's personality. That said, the house's original somewhat bland design is also important. I personally feel its simplicity helps set the stage for Homer's rivalry with Ned Flanders, because Ned's home is so pristine and ideal, which is an extension to his overly perfect persona. But if every house on the street looked just like Ned's, it would undermine the dynamic between them and lessen the contrast that fuels their interactions. So yes, the occupants may come and go, switch or get sent to jail, but 740 Evergreen Terrace will always be the Brown House. Thank you so much for watching. To support my channel, you can join my Flying Hellfish unit over on Patreon. You'll get early access to videos on this channel, as well as Lydia Loves Timelines, your name in the credits, an acceptance letter, vintage Simpsons postcards, and some swanky stickers. Anyway, thank you so much, and I'll smell you later.